Welcome to the store. Don't forget to subscribe, and support me.
The world had known war since the dawn of time. In the lands where the mountains kissed the heavens and rivers stretched beyond the horizon, a shadow fell over every mortal soul. The undying legion marched, their footsteps shaking the earth, their presence like a plague upon the land. No kingdom had been spared from their wrath, no village left untouched by their thirst for eternal conquest. The immortal warriors, untouched by time and death, had become the nightmare of the living. Talus had seen the horrors firsthand. His village had once stood tall in the valley, protected by towering oak trees and the gentle lull of the wind sweeping through the fields. But that peace had been shattered when the undying legion came. The people, the warriors who had sworn to defend the village, had fought with every ounce of strength they had. And yet, it had not been enough. The immortals could not die. No blade could pierce their skin, no fire could burn them. The village had crumbled, and with it, the last remnants of Talus's old life. He remembered standing on the hill, watching as the flames consumed everything he had known, while the undying legion marched forward, unscathed and unstoppable. That day, a fire ignited in him. Not a fire of vengeance, but a fire of resolve. If immortality could not be fought with brute strength, then it had to be fought with something else: wisdom, tactics, and the boundless will of the human spirit. Years passed, and Talus had become more than just a survivor. He had risen through the ranks of the kingdom's military, not because of his strength. He was not the strongest warrior by any means, but because of his mind. He had studied the ways of the undying legion, analyzed their every move, every weakness. He had fought them in skirmishes, small battles where the mortals stood no chance, and yet Talus found ways to turn those battles into victories. His victories were not won by overwhelming force, but by outsmarting his immortal foes. And with each victory, his name spread further. Now, the kingdom itself was under siege. The undying legion had come for them, as they had come for every other land. The king had no choice but to fight back, but the hopelessness in the eyes of his soldiers was palpable. They knew what awaited them: an enemy that could not die. Desperation hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Talus stood in the war room, surrounded by generals and advisors who argued over strategies that, in the end, they all knew would fail. The king, a weary man with lines of age etched into his face, listened in silence as his advisors bickered. Finally, Talus spoke. "We can't win this by fighting them on their terms," he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "We've tried that before, and we've seen the results. They don't die. We do." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Talus, some with hope, others with skepticism. "So what do you propose, Talus?" the king asked, his voice heavy with exhaustion. Talus met the king's gaze, unwavering. "We don't fight them head-on. We hit them where they're vulnerable." One of the generals scoffed. "They don't have vulnerabilities, boy. That's the whole point." "They do," Talus said. "Not in the way you think. But every army has weaknesses. They may be immortal, but they still follow patterns. They have a leader, they have egos, and they believe their immortality makes them invincible. We can use that against them." The king raised an eyebrow. "You think you can outwit them?" "I know I can," Talus replied. "We've been trying to fight them like we're equals, but we're not. They have eternity, but they still bleed. We just need to make them bleed." The room remained tense, but there was a spark of curiosity in the king's eyes now. "You're suggesting a different kind of battle." "A battle of the mind," Talus said. "We use their strength against them. They believe they're untouchable, which makes them predictable. If we can exploit that arrogance, we can turn the tide. The king nodded slowly. And how do you plan to do that? Talus stepped forward, laying out a map of the kingdom on the table. First, we gather a team. A small group, skilled in stealth and strategy. We don't need an army, we need precision. Then, we strike at their weakest point, their leader. Without him, their forces will crumble. He's the one who holds them together, the one who believes in his immortality the most. We take him out, and the rest will follow. The generals exchanged uncertain glances, but the king's expression was thoughtful. It's a dangerous plan. It's the only plan that gives us a chance, Talus said firmly. After a long moment, the king nodded. Very well. You have my support, Talus. Gather your team, and may the gods be with you. Talus left the war room with a sense of purpose, but he knew the road ahead would be perilous. The Undying Legion was unlike any enemy he had ever faced. Their strength, their immortality, was a force of nature. But Talus wasn't afraid. He had learned long ago that fear only clouded judgment. What he needed now was clarity. He wasted no time assembling his team. He handpicked each member with care, knowing that this mission required more than just skill in battle. It required cunning, adaptability, and above all, trust. First was Sienna, a master archer whose precision with a bow was unmatched. She had fought alongside Talus before, and he knew she could be counted on to strike swiftly and silently when the time came. Next was Kale, a mage who specialized in illusion and misdirection. Kale's magic wasn't the kind that could overpower an army, but it could confuse and disorient, giving Talus the advantage he needed to outmaneuver the immortals. Then there was Orin, a thief with a knack for infiltration. He had spent years living in the shadows, slipping in and out of enemy strongholds without leaving a trace. Talus knew that Orin's skills would be invaluable when it came to breaching the Undying Legion's defenses. Together, they formed a team that could accomplish what no army could. But even with this carefully selected group, Talus knew that their mission was a gamble. One misstep, one mistake, and they would be facing an immortal enemy with no way out. As they set out on their journey, Talus briefed them on the plan. Their target was the Undying Legion's leader, a warrior who had lived for centuries and commanded the loyalty of every immortal soldier under his banner. Taking him down would not be easy, but it was the only way to disrupt the Legion's cohesion. We'll strike at night, Talus explained as they camped near the forest where the Legion had been seen. Their leader trusts in his immortality, which means he won't be expecting an attack. We use that to our advantage. Sienna nodded, her expression grim. What happens when they realize we're not fighting fair? Talus allowed himself a small smile. By the time they realize it, it'll be too late. The forest was thick with shadows as Talus and his team moved silently through the trees. The Undying Legion's camp was just ahead, a cluster of tents and banners illuminated by the soft glow of magical torches. The immortals patrolled lazily, confident that no mortal army would dare attack them. Talus crouched behind a fallen log, watching the camp from a distance. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind was clear. This was the moment they had been preparing for. Orin, he whispered. You're up. Orin nodded and slipped into the shadows, moving so silently that even Talus, who was watching him closely, could barely see him. The thief disappeared into the camp, weaving between the tents and guards without drawing a single glance. Minutes passed, and Talus waited, his eyes scanning the camp for any sign of trouble. Finally, Orin reappeared at the edge of the camp, giving a brief nod. The way was clear. Let's move, Talus said, motioning for the others to follow. They crept toward the camp, each step carefully placed to avoid detection. When they reached the first tent, Kale whispered an incantation, and a wave of illusionary magic washed over them, cloaking them in shadows. To the guards, they were invisible, just another part of the forest's darkness. Talus led the way, his eyes fixed on the large tent at the center of the camp, the tent where the leader of the Undying Legion was resting. This was their chance. One quick strike, and they could end the war before the Legion even knew what had happened. Talus moved forward, his heart pounding as they approached the leader's tent. The magic that cloaked them made their presence invisible, and the immortal guards seemed completely unaware of their existence. Sienna was right behind him, her bow at the ready, while Kale and Oren flanked them, watching for any sign of danger. Every step felt heavier than the last, knowing that if they were discovered, the odds of escaping alive were slim. As they reached the entrance of the tent, Talus raised his hand, signaling the others to stop. He glanced at Oren, who nodded and moved forward to cut a small slit in the back of the tent. With practiced precision, Oren slipped through the opening, followed by Talus and the others. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of burning incense, and the soft glow of candles cast eerie shadows across the fabric walls. At the center of the tent, lying on a large bed draped in silk, was the leader of the Undying Legion. His face was calm, his chest rising and falling in a rhythmic pattern, as if completely untroubled by the world outside. He was dressed in ceremonial armor, his sword resting within arm's reach, but he appeared vulnerable, relaxed in his immortality. Talus tightened his grip on his dagger, moving toward the leader's bedside. The others took their positions, each ready to strike should something go wrong. This was it, the moment they had worked for, the moment that could change the fate of the war. But as Talus raised his dagger, ready to plunge it into the immortal leader's heart, the man's eyes snapped open. The sudden movement was so swift that it took Talus by surprise. In one fluid motion, the leader rolled out of bed and was on his feet, sword in hand, his gaze sharp and focused. "You mortals never learn," the leader said, his voice calm but filled with a cold certainty. "You cannot kill what cannot die." Talus didn't flinch. "We'll see about that." The leader lunged, his sword flashing in the candlelight. Talus barely had time to parry, the force of the impact sending a jolt through his arm. The immortal's strength was immense, but Talus had anticipated that. He didn't need to match the man's power, he needed to outthink him. "Kale!" Talus shouted, and the mage reacted instantly, casting a spell that filled the tent with a thick, disorienting fog. The leader hesitated for a split second, just long enough for Talus to disengage and regroup with the others. "We need to keep him off balance," Talus whispered. "He's strong, but he's arrogant. We use that." Sienna loosed an arrow into the fog, the sharp whistle of the projectile cutting through the air. The leader deflected it with ease, but his movements were slower now, hindered by the cloud of magic. Talus circled around, using the fog to his advantage, striking whenever he saw an opening. He knew they couldn't win a prolonged fight, the leader's immortality gave him the advantage, but if they could land one decisive blow, they could weaken him. Oren darted in and out of the fog, slashing at the leader's legs, trying to destabilize him. The leader roared in frustration, swinging his sword wildly, but the team's coordinated attacks were wearing him down. "You think you can defeat me?" the leader growled, his voice echoing through the fog. "I have lived for centuries. I have conquered empires. I am eternal." Talus smirked, even as he felt the strain of the fight. "You may be eternal, but you're not invincible." With a swift motion, Talus threw his dagger, aiming not for the leader's heart, but for the small gap in his armor at the shoulder. The blade struck true, sinking into the flesh with a sickening sound. The leader snarled in pain, his movements faltering for the first time. Sienna followed up with another arrow, this time aimed at his knee. The immortal warrior fell to one knee, still fighting, but weakened. His immortality couldn't prevent injury, and the damage was accumulating. Talus knew they had to act fast. The leader's wounds wouldn't be enough to kill him, but they could immobilize him long enough to end this once and for all. Oren, Kale, get the others out, Talus ordered. Sienna, cover them. What about you? Sienna asked, her voice tight with concern. Talus didn't answer. He knew what needed to be done. The leader of the Undying Legion was too dangerous to leave alive, and there was only one way to ensure he didn't rise again. As his team moved to retreat, Talus approached the fallen leader, who was still struggling to rise. Blood oozed from his wounds, but his eyes burned with fury and defiance. This won't stop me, the leader spat. You cannot kill me. Talus stood over him, his expression hard. I don't need to kill you. I just need to keep you down. Before the leader could respond, Talus plunged his sword into the ground beside him, and a surge of magic erupted from the earth. The spell Talus had prepared was Ancient, a binding spell that would trap the immortal in place, preventing him from escaping or healing. The leader's eyes widened in shock as the ground around him began to glow, chains of magic wrapping around his limbs, pinning him to the spot. What have you done? Talus wiped the sweat from his brow, watching as the spell completed its work. You're immortal, but now you're imprisoned. You'll live forever, but you'll never leave this place. The leader screamed in rage, thrashing against the magical bindings, but it was no use. The spell held firm, and Talus knew it would hold for eternity. With the leader incapacitated, Talus turned and walked out of the tent, his heart heavy but resolute. He had done what needed to be done. The war wasn't over, but this victory would turn the tide. Without their leader, the Undying Legion would falter, their invincibility shattered. As Talus rejoined his team, they looked at him with a mixture of relief and awe. They had won, but the cost had been high. The weight of mortality hung over them all. Sienna was the first to speak. Is it over? Talus shook his head. Not yet. But we've made sure their leader won't rise again. The Undying Legion will crumble without him. Kale sighed, exhaustion etched into his features. And what about us? Talus glanced at his team, at the warriors who had followed him into the heart of danger. They were battered and bruised, but they were alive. We go back, Talus said. We rebuild. And we show the world that immortality isn't the only path to victory. The journey home was long and filled with silence, each of them lost in their own thoughts. The kingdom they returned to was scarred by war, its people weary and broken, but there was a flicker of hope in their eyes when they saw Talus and his team. Word of their victory had spread, and though the fight against the Undying Legion was far from over, there was a sense that, for the first time, the immortals could be beaten. Talus stood at the edge of the rebuilt village, looking out at the horizon as the sun dipped below the mountains. He had been offered the chance to seek immortality himself, to join the ranks of the eternal, but he had declined. Life was meant to be lived, and it was the fleeting nature of it that made it worth fighting for. As the wind whispered through the trees, Talus closed his eyes and smiled. The battle had been won, and though he knew more challenges awaited, he was ready. For in the end, it wasn't the power of immortality that defined a warrior, it was the will to fight, to endure, and to live, and that, Talus knew, was eternal.